Most men measure their progress by what happens between sunrise and sunset. They count the hours worked, the tasks completed, the calls made, the meetings attended. They review the visible record of a day and conclude that effort alone determines outcome. This is an understandable assumption. It is also incomplete. There is a period of your day that receives almost no deliberate attention from the majority of people, and it is precisely this period that quietly determines whether the effort of your waking hours compounds into something significant or simply repeats itself without accumulation. That period is the hour before sleep. Not because sleep is magical, not because the night holds any mystical power over your ambitions, but because of a straightforward behavioral reality. The mental state in which you conclude each day shapes the mental state in which you begin the next one. And the mental state in which you begin each day determines the quality of every decision, every interaction, and every response to challenge that follows. Do this carelessly for a decade, and the damage is invisible but real, accumulated across thousands of small decisions made from a slightly lower level of clarity, composure, and directed purpose than would otherwise have been available. Do it deliberately for a year, and the benefit is equally invisible to outside observers, but the results become very visible indeed. Napoleon Hill spent the better part of 3 decades examining the private disciplines of men who produced results that their backgrounds and circumstances did not seem to explain. What he found, across different industries, different eras, and different starting points, was a consistent pattern of private mental conduct that the publicly visible record of these men's lives never fully captured. The crowd examined their business decisions, their negotiating strategies, their investment choices. The crowd looked for the cause of unusual results in the places where results are usually visible, in transactions, in timing, in connections. The cause was elsewhere. It was in the private hours, in the quality of thought that preceded rest, in the disciplines that no one witnessed and few would have considered significant if they had. This message is not about a night routine in the conventional sense. It is about 3 specific forces that operate in the hours before sleep, forces that either work for you or against you, whether or not you are aware of them. Understanding these forces is the beginning. Deliberately directing them is the practice that separates the man who builds from the man who drifts. Before this message concludes, you will understand each force precisely, how it operates, what it costs when neglected, and what it produces when directed. You will also understand why this particular window of time carries influence that the rest of the day does not. The question at the beginning of this conversation is straightforward. What does the hour before sleep actually do to a person? And the answer, examined carefully, changes how you think about every evening that follows. Part 1. The closing mechanism. Why the evening hours carry disproportionate weight. There is a principle in behavioral psychology, well documented and practically applicable, that describes how the human mind processes and consolidates experience. During waking hours, the mind is primarily occupied with managing the immediate environment, responding to incoming information, making real-time decisions, navigating social interaction, sustaining physical activity. It is, in the language of cognitive science, primarily in a reactive mode. As wakefulness gives way to rest, the mind shifts function. It moves from reactive management of the present to consolidative processing of what has accumulated. Impressions are organized. Patterns are reinforced. Emotional residue from the day's events is processed and either resolved or carried forward. The experiences of the day are, in a real sense, filed, and how they are filed determines how accessible and influential they remain. This consolidative function is not passive. It does not simply record and store what happened. It strengthens patterns, making the neural pathways associated with frequently repeated thoughts and behaviors more efficient, more automatic, more reflexive. In practical terms, what you think about consistently in the evening hours becomes more natural to think about. What you feel habitually in the hours before sleep becomes your default emotional tone. What you review repeatedly becomes the lens through which you interpret new experience. This is not a theory about the night. It is a description of how behavioral patterns form and solidify in the human mind. And the evening hours are, by the nature of this consolidative process, the period in which the day's patterns are most directly reinforced or redirected. Napoleon Hill understood this principle not in the language of neuroscience. His era preceded that vocabulary, but in the language of practical observation. He observed that the men who built remarkable things were, without exception, men who managed what occupied their minds in the hours before rest. Not because they had been told to do so by a philosophy teacher, but because their own experience confirmed what Hill's research documented. The quality of thought before sleep had a measurable influence on the quality of judgment, decision, and conduct that followed. Andrew Carnegie, whose industrial empire represented one of the most significant accumulations of productive wealth in the 19th century, was described by those who worked closely with him as a man who concluded his days with unusual deliberateness. He did not drift into the evening. He was known to spend the final portion of his working day reviewing not what had been accomplished, but what direction the following day required. He carried specific questions into the night, not as sources of anxiety, but as problems he expected his thinking to work upon. This practice was not unique to Carnegie. It appears, in various forms, in the accounts of men who built lasting results across different fields and different periods. The specific forms differ. The underlying structure is consistent. Deliberate engagement with the day's experience before rest, directed toward correction, preparation, and the reinforcement of chosen standards. What most men do instead is the opposite. They conclude the day by whatever combination of fatigue and habit dictates. They review what went wrong without extracting the lesson that correction requires. They carry frustration into the evening hours, not as a problem to be solved, but as an emotional state to be inhabited. They allow the distractions of entertainment and passive consumption to occupy the final hours of wakefulness, delivering neither the genuine rest of true disengagement nor the deliberate direction of purposeful thought. The consolidative function of the mind operates regardless. It processes and reinforces whatever was most present in the final period of wakefulness. If what was most present was frustration, comparison, and unresolved anxiety, those are the patterns that receive reinforcement. If what was most present was directed review, specific correction, and clear intention, those are the patterns that strengthen. The difference in what these two approaches produce is not immediately obvious. One evening of careless drift produces almost no measurable consequence. The compounding, however, is real. After a year of evening hours lived without deliberate direction, the behavioral patterns that have been nightly reinforced are those of reactive, unexamined habit. After a year of evening hours lived with even modest deliberateness, the patterns reinforced are those of examined conduct and directed improvement. The financial divergence between these two men, after 5 years, is not explained by any single decision or any single period of effort. It is the accumulated product of thousands of small differences in the quality of judgment, decision, and conduct, differences that trace back, in large part, to whether the evening hours were spent in drift or in direction. This is the first force, the consolidative weight of what occupies the mind before rest. It operates whether or not you direct it. The only choice is whether you direct it deliberately or leave it to habit. Part 2. The examination problem, what unreviewed days actually cost. There is a quality shared by the majority of people that goes largely unexamined because it does not feel like a problem. It feels like normalcy. It is the quality of allowing each day to pass without genuine review, not without thought. Most people think extensively about their days. They replay events, experience emotional reactions, form opinions about what others did or said, plan logistics for tomorrow. This is not the same as genuine review. It is mental activity, but it is reactive mental activity, oriented toward processing emotion and managing the immediate rather than examining conduct and extracting applicable correction. The distinction matters enormously. Reactive processing of a day's events leaves the behavioral patterns that produced those events essentially unchanged. If a conversation went poorly, reactive processing produces an emotional response, frustration, justification, blame, or regret, but rarely produces the specific behavioral identification that would prevent the same outcome in the next comparable conversation. If an opportunity was missed, reactive processing produces the feeling of having missed it without the clear identification of the specific choice or habit that caused the miss. Genuine review is different in structure and in outcome. It asks not, how do I feel about what happened, but what specifically in my conduct produced this result, and what specifically would I do differently? These are different questions, and they engage different cognitive processes. The first question is emotional and evaluative. The second is analytical and corrective. Napoleon Hill described this distinction in terms of what he called organized thought, the practice of directing mental activity towards specific, productive ends rather than allowing it to follow emotional habit. His observation was that the men who consistently improved were those who subjected their own conduct to regular, honest, specific examination, and that this examination was most productively conducted at the close of each day, before the details had faded and before the next day's demands had displaced the previous day's lessons. The cost of skipping this examination is cumulative and largely invisible. Consider a man whose professional presentations consistently fall slightly short of their potential. Not dramatically, not enough to cause obvious failure, but enough to reduce their persuasive impact by a meaningful margin. If this man does not examine his presentations with specific honesty, he does not identify the precise habits, perhaps a tendency to hedge conclusions, or to over-explain preliminary points at the expense of the central argument, that are producing this result. He continues the same presentations. The slight deficiency persists. Over 3 years of regular presentations, the accumulated cost of this unidentified and uncorrected habit represents a significant quantity of missed influence, missed advancement, and missed income. If, on the other hand, this man had developed the practice of reviewing each significant professional interaction with specific honesty at the day's close, he would have identified the hedging or the over-explanation within the first few instances. He would have formed a specific correction, not a general intention to do better, but a specific behavioral change. His next presentation would have incorporated that change. The correction, refined over subsequent presentations through subsequent reviews, would have progressively improved his effectiveness. Over 3 years, the accumulated benefit of this iterative correction represents a significant advantage over the version of himself that never examined the pattern. This is not a hypothetical mechanism. It is the documented behavioral pattern of people who consistently improve at complex skills, from professional communication to financial decision-making to leadership effectiveness. Deliberate practice, as it has been studied extensively, is distinguished from ordinary practice not primarily by duration or intensity, but by the quality of review that follows each performance. Without specific, honest review, practice reinforces existing patterns. With it, practice refines them. The evening hours are the natural window for this review. The day's experience is fresh enough to examine in detail. The next day's demands have not yet arrived to compete for attention. The physiological state of the body as it approaches rest supports reflective, inward-directed thought rather than the outward-directed reactive processing of active daytime hours. What prevents most people from using this window productively is not time and not intelligence. It is the discomfort of honest self-examination and the habit of using the evening hours for the comfortable alternative of passive consumption. Honest self-examination requires confronting deficiencies without the buffer of justification or excuse. It requires naming, specifically, what fell short, not in a spirit of self-punishment, but in the spirit of a craftsman examining his work for flaws that the next iteration can correct. This is not a natural or comfortable habit for most people. It requires a degree of equanimity, the ability to view one's own conduct with the same analytical detachment one might apply to a business process or a technical problem. This equanimity is itself a practiced skill. It does not arise fully formed. The first weeks of genuine self-examination are often uncomfortable because the specific deficiencies that honest review identifies are frequently things the person already sensed but had been successfully avoiding through the comfortable habit of vague self-assessment. The discomfort diminishes with practice. What was initially a confrontation with uncomfortable specifics becomes, over time, a routine of professional self-management, as natural as reviewing financial statements or maintaining equipment. The man who has practiced honest daily review for 6 months approaches it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone maintaining a valuable tool. The discomfort has been replaced by the quiet satisfaction of consistent self-improvement. This is the second force, the examined day. It costs almost nothing to implement and almost everything to skip across a decade of unreviewed daily conduct. Part 3. The Standards Architecture. How the conduct you accept at night becomes the conduct you produce by day. Every man operates according to a set of standards. Not the standards he would articulate if asked, but the standards that actually govern his behavior under normal conditions. The level of effort he accepts as sufficient. The quality of output he produces without external pressure. The conduct he permits himself when no immediate consequence is visible. These standards are not chosen consciously in most cases. They are formed gradually, through the repeated experience of what is accepted and what is not, by the person himself and by the environment around him. They are maintained or eroded through the same mechanism, repetition. A standard that is consistently reinforced becomes more deeply established. A standard that is consistently violated without correction becomes progressively weaker. This is simply how behavioral standards function. They are maintained by their own exercise and eroded by their own abandonment. The evening hours play a specific role in this architecture. The review of each day's conduct against the standards a person has set for himself either reinforces those standards or implicitly accepts their erosion. A man who reviews his day and identifies a moment where his conduct fell below his chosen standard, and who then forms a specific correction for the following day, is actively reinforcing the standard, signaling to himself, through the act of examination and correction, that the standard remains in force. A man who allows the same moment to pass unexamined is implicitly accepting the lower conduct as sufficient. The difference in behavioral terms is significant. Standards that are regularly examined and actively maintained become the effective operating baseline, the level of conduct that feels normal and automatic. Standards that are regularly violated without examination or correction gradually become aspirational rather than operational. They remain as stated beliefs about how one should behave, while ceasing to function as effective governors of how one actually behaves. Napoleon Hill described this dynamic in terms of what he called definiteness of purpose, the practice of maintaining a specific, chosen direction with such consistency that it organizes all subsidiary conduct around it. His observation was that the men who sustained significant advancement over time were those whose chosen standards had become deeply operational, not merely stated intentions, but actual behavioral baselines, governing conduct even in the absence of external accountability. Building this depth of operational standard requires regular, private examination. External accountability, the pressure of observation, evaluation, and consequence from others, can temporarily raise the level of conduct a person displays. But it does not build the internal standard. The moment external accountability is removed, conduct returns to the internal baseline. Only internal examination and internal reinforcement build standards that persist when no one is watching. Henry Ford's production of mechanical innovation was not sustained by external accountability alone. He was, for extended periods of his career, working on problems that his contemporaries considered either impractical or already solved. The accountability structure that most people depend on, the validation of others, the recognition of progress, the social reinforcement of continued effort, was frequently absent. What sustained his work was an internal standard maintained through private, disciplined self-examination. He reviewed his own progress against his own chosen criteria, identified specific deficiencies, formed specific improvements, and continued, not because the external environment rewarded this persistence, but because his internal standards had become genuinely operational. This capacity for self-sustained standards is, arguably, the most practically significant quality that distinguishes people who build lasting results from those who produce results only when externally driven. External drive is abundant but inconsistent. It fluctuates with circumstances, with recognition, with the social environment. Internal drive, built from genuinely operational standards maintained through regular private examination, is far more consistent. It is also rarer, because building it requires the unglamorous practice of private self-examination maintained without external reward for the period of time necessary for the internal standard to genuinely deepen. The evening hours are where this deepening occurs. Each night of honest review, specific correction, and deliberate recommitment to chosen standards is a deposit into the internal standard's operational depth. Each night of unexamined drift is a withdrawal. The balance in this account, accumulated over months and years, determines whether the man operates from genuinely internalized standards or from perpetually restated aspirations that never quite govern actual conduct. The practical implications are financial as much as behavioral. A man whose internal standards for professional conduct, for the quality of his work, for the honesty of his communication, and for the consistency of his follow-through are genuinely operational, not merely stated but actually governing, is a man who produces greater value in every professional context he enters. And value, consistently produced, consistently recognized, and consistently compensated, is the behavioral foundation of financial advancement. Part 4. The Preparation Gap. What tomorrow's most capable men are doing tonight. There is a question that almost no one asks at the end of a working day. What specifically do I need to think about, understand, or decide before tomorrow begins? The question sounds simple. Its implications are significant. Most people end their days in a state of mental suspension regarding the following day. They may have a general sense of what is scheduled. They may have reviewed a list of tasks. But the specific quality of thought that each item on tomorrow's agenda requires, The mental preparation that would allow them to engage those items at the highest level of clarity and judgment they are capable of has almost never been considered. This is not laziness. It is a gap in how most people have been taught to think about preparation. Preparation is typically understood as gathering information or organizing materials, the logistical prerequisites for work. Mental preparation, the deliberate engagement with a problem or decision before the moment of performance, is far less commonly practiced and far less commonly discussed. Yet the evidence for its value is extensive and practical. The most consistently effective performers in complex professional fields, whether in negotiation, strategic decision-making, leadership, or creative problem-solving, share a consistent practice of deliberate prior thought. They engage with the problems they will face before they face them, not at the moment of performance, but in the quieter hours that precede it. They identify the specific considerations that will matter, the specific responses that different scenarios might require, the specific standards against which their performance will be evaluated. This prior engagement has a measurable effect on performance quality. It is not that the pre-thinking magically produces correct answers in advance. It is that engagement with a problem before the pressure of immediate performance allows for a quality of thought that immediate performance rarely permits. Under the pressure of real-time execution, the mind is managing multiple demands simultaneously, maintaining composure, reading the room, managing logistics, attending to the other party, and thinking about the substance of the matter. When the substance has already been thought through in advance, the cognitive load during performance is meaningfully reduced. More of the available mental resource can be directed toward the quality of execution itself. Napoleon Hill described the related principle in terms of organized thought and prepared purpose. His observation was that the men who performed consistently at high levels in complex professional situations were those who had developed the practice of engaging mentally with their most significant upcoming challenges before those challenges arrived. They were not improvising at the moment of performance. They were executing thinking they had already done. The evening hours are ideally suited for this form of preparation. The day's demands have concluded. The following day's demands have not yet arrived. The relative quiet of the evening supports the kind of unhurried, exploratory mental engagement that substantive prior thought requires. A man who spends 20 minutes before sleep genuinely thinking through the most significant challenge or decision he will face the following day arrives at that challenge in a qualitatively different state than one who encounters it fresh. This is not the same as anxiety. Anxious preoccupation with tomorrow's challenges is not preparation. It is rumination, which produces emotional agitation without substantive thought. The distinction is in the direction and quality of the mental engagement. Preparation asks specific questions. What are the key considerations? What are the most likely scenarios? And what does each require? What is the outcome I am working toward? And what specific conduct will best serve that outcome? These questions orient the mind toward problem solving. Rumination asks only what might go wrong and produces agitation without direction. The man who has practiced deliberate prior thought as a regular element of his evening discipline finds that the quality of his professional execution improves progressively, not because his fundamental capabilities change, but because those capabilities are consistently being deployed from a more prepared and less reactive state. Over years, this consistent improvement in execution quality accumulates into a significant professional advantage. The capacity for deliberate prior thought is also a component of what others observe and describe as composure, judgment, or strategic thinking. When a man consistently performs at a high level even under conditions of pressure or uncertainty, observers attribute this to innate quality. The actual source, more often than not, is the unglamorous practice of arriving at pressured situations having already thought carefully about what they require. Part 5. The resolution practice. How closing each day completely changes what the next one opens with. There is a form of mental weight that most people carry continuously and never examine directly. It is the accumulated residue of unresolved daily experience, the concerns, decisions, and interactions that were neither fully processed nor genuinely set aside, but simply deferred into a background of ongoing, low-level mental activity. This background activity is not neutral. It consumes cognitive resource, the same resource that would otherwise be available for the focused, clear thinking that high-quality professional performance requires. A man who carries 5 unresolved concerns from the previous week into each new working day is a man whose available cognitive capacity is, in some real measure, already committed before the day begins. This is not a metaphorical description. It reflects the established understanding of how attention and cognitive resource function. The mind has a finite capacity for focused engagement at any given time. Unresolved matters compete for that capacity continuously, even when they are not the subject of conscious thought. They manifest as a persistent sense of mental fullness or fatigue that is not proportional to the actual demands of the current moment. They reduce the depth of focus available for the task at hand. They increase the cognitive effort required to sustain attention on anything that requires genuine concentration. The practical effect of this accumulated residue on professional performance is significant. Decisions made from a background of cognitive overload are measurably lower quality than decisions made from a state of genuine clarity. Interactions conducted from a state of accumulated mental weight are less perceptive, less creative, and less adaptable than interactions conducted from genuine presence. The man who carries 2 months of unresolved concerns into a significant negotiation or leadership challenge is not bringing his full capability to that challenge. He is bringing what remains of it after the accumulated weight has taken its share. The resolution practice, the deliberate closure of each day's experience before sleep, addresses this directly. It is not a meditation practice or an emotional processing exercise in the therapeutic sense. It is a cognitive housekeeping function. Its purpose is to ensure that each day's experience is either genuinely resolved, understood, corrected where necessary, and closed, or genuinely set aside with a specific intention to address it at a defined future time. The distinction between resolution and suppression is important. Suppression, pushing an unresolved concern out of conscious attention without actually addressing it, does not reduce its background cognitive cost. The concern continues to occupy cognitive resource regardless of whether it is being consciously acknowledged. Resolution, or the clear setting aside with a specific future address, actually reduces the background cost. The mind, having received a clear signal that the matter has been allocated, reduces the persistent allocation of attention to it. Napoleon Hill's framework addressed this through the concept of organized thought, the practice of ensuring that mental activity is directed rather than scattered. A man whose mental activity is primarily directed has cognitive resource available for purposeful application. A man whose mental activity is primarily scattered across unresolved concerns and unexamined accumulated experience has that resource largely committed to background processing. The evening resolution practice creates a daily boundary between one day's experience and the next. Each day's most significant experiences, the interactions, decisions, challenges, and outcomes, are reviewed and either resolved or clearly allocated. The mental state in which the person then approaches rest is one of relative completion rather than accumulated incompleteness. And the mental state in which they begin the following day reflects this. greater clarity, greater available focus, greater capacity for the quality of engagement that significant work requires. This practice produces an effect that observers consistently describe, in successful people who maintain it, as presence. The quality of being genuinely, fully engaged with the current moment and the current task, not divided between the task at hand and the background noise of accumulated unresolved experience. Presence, in this practical sense, is not a personality trait. It is a cognitive state that reflects the degree to which available mental resource is genuinely available rather than already committed. Building this state consistently through the daily resolution practice is one of the most practically significant investments a person can make in their own professional effectiveness. Its effects are not immediately dramatic. They compound over months and years into a qualitative difference in the depth of engagement, the quality of judgment, and the clarity of decision that the person consistently brings to their work. Part 6. The practical construction, building the evening discipline into real conditions. Understanding the forces described in the previous sections is a beginning. The beginning matters, but it produces nothing without the translation into specific, repeatable practice. The practical question is not what the ideal evening discipline looks like under perfect conditions. It is what a workable version looks like under the conditions that actually exist, including fatigue, disrupted schedules, competing demands on time, and the psychological pull of the path of least resistance that every consistent practice must contend with. The answer, examined through the experience of people who have maintained deliberate evening practices over extended periods, is that the workable version is simpler than most descriptions suggest, and that simplicity is a feature, not a limitation. Begin with a single consistent boundary, a defined time, typically 15 to 30 minutes before the intended sleep time, that is reserved for the evening practice regardless of what has preceded it. This boundary does not require ideal conditions. It requires only the decision to observe it. On evenings when it can be honored fully, the practice can be conducted with more depth. On evenings when fatigue or circumstance has reduced available time or energy, the minimum viable practice. Review the day's single most significant event, identify one specific correction, close with one clear statement of tomorrow's direction. Takes less than 5 minutes and still delivers the core function. Consistency matters more than completeness. A simplified version maintained every evening produces far greater cumulative benefit than a thorough version conducted whenever conditions happen to permit. The mechanism requires repetition. Occasional thorough practice does not build the same depth of internalized standard that consistent, even minimal practice builds over time. The specific structure of the practice, once the consistent boundary has been established, should include 4 elements conducted in whatever order and with whatever depth conditions permit. The first element is the day's most significant review, not a comprehensive accounting of everything that happened. That would be impractical and counterproductive, but the identification of the 2 or 3 most consequential interactions, decisions, or moments of the day. These may be the most successful, the most challenging, or the most representative of the behavioral patterns that matter most to the person's professional development. The question for each is specific. What in my conduct produced this result? And is that conduct what I would choose to repeat? The second element is specific correction. For each identified instance where conduct fell below the chosen standard, a specific behavioral change is formed. Not an intention, I will try harder, produces nothing, but a precise behavioral prescription. In the next comparable situation, I will do this specific thing differently. The specificity is what gives the correction genuine operational power. Vague intentions diffuse across general behavior without changing any specific behavior. Precise corrections target the specific behavioral pattern that requires change. The third element is preparation engagement. One item from tomorrow's schedule or anticipated challenges is engaged with specifically. What does this require? What considerations matter? What outcome am I working toward? And what specific conduct will best serve that outcome? This does not require exhaustive analysis. Even 10 minutes of genuine prior thought on a significant upcoming challenge produces a meaningful improvement in the quality of engagement with that challenge. The fourth element is the explicit closure. A brief, clear statement of the standard the following day will be governed by. Not a wish or a hope, but a statement of intention with the specific quality of a decision. Tomorrow's conduct will be characterized by these specific standards, and I will hold that intention before any other consideration. This final element serves the consolidative function described earlier. It is the directed impression that the evening's mental processing will work upon and reinforce through the night. These four elements, conducted with genuine engagement, require between 10 and 25 minutes. They require no equipment, no special conditions, and no unusual discipline beyond the initial establishment of the consistent time boundary. What they require, over time, is the willingness to continue on the evenings when the practice feels least productive, the evenings of genuine fatigue, when the review surfaces nothing more than the observation that the day was ordinary and tomorrow requires ordinary continuation. These evenings are where the practice's depth is actually built. Not in the evenings of significant challenges and significant corrections, when the practice feels obviously valuable, but in the ordinary evenings where the only achievement is the maintenance of the habit itself. Habit maintenance in ordinary conditions is where behavioral patterns develop the depth that allows them to function reliably under extraordinary conditions. The man who has maintained a daily evening review through 3 months of ordinary evenings has built a practice that will function with genuine effectiveness when an extraordinary challenge makes the evening review critically important. The man who has practiced only when he felt motivated has built nothing that will function reliably when motivation is absent. Part 7. The long view. What 3 years of directed evenings actually produces. The temptation, when discussing any developmental practice, is to focus on the short-term indicators, the observable changes within weeks or months that provide confirmation that the practice is working. These short-term indicators are real and worth acknowledging. But the most significant return on consistent evening discipline is not visible in the short term. It is visible in the 3rd and 4th year. This is not an accident of timing. It reflects the nature of what consistent evening discipline actually builds. In the first months, what changes is primarily the person's relationship with their own conduct. They develop a more honest and specific understanding of their behavioral patterns, and they begin forming and implementing corrections with greater precision. This is valuable, but its impact on external outcomes is modest, because most significant professional outcomes depend on sustained behavioral change measured in years, not weeks. In the 2nd year, the behavioral changes that the first year's corrections initiated begin to manifest as observable differences in professional conduct. Communication carries more precision. Decision-making reflects more clarity. The ability to sustain focused engagement on complex work improves measurably. These changes begin to produce small but real differences in professional outcomes. Slightly more effective interactions, slightly better decisions, slightly more consistent follow-through on significant commitments. By the 3rd year, 2 things have occurred that were not visible in the earlier phases. First, the internalized standards that the evening practice has been reinforcing have reached a genuine operational depth. They function automatically, governing conduct without requiring conscious effort. Second, The cumulative effect of 2.5 years of specific corrections, each one improving the precision of subsequent corrections, has produced behavioral capabilities that are qualitatively superior to those that existed at the beginning of the practice. The financial and professional outcomes that result from this 3-year development are not the product of any single decision, any single period of effort, or any single visible change. They are the accumulated product of thousands of small improvements, each one individually modest, collectively transformative. Napoleon Hill described this in terms of the compounding nature of organized thought and habitual self-examination. His observation was that the men who produced remarkable results did not produce them suddenly. They produced them as the expression of years of private development that preceded the visible outcomes by a significant period. The public results appeared suddenly to observers who had not watched the private development. To the man who had conducted that private development daily, the results felt like the logical continuation of a direction he had been building for years. This gap between private development and public result is one of the primary reasons that most people abandon developmental practices before they produce their full return. The practice feels, for an extended period, like investment without visible return. The behavioral improvements are real but modest. The professional outcomes are incrementally better but not dramatically different. The person who requires rapid, visible confirmation of progress abandons the practice at precisely the point where the compounding is beginning to accelerate. The person who understands the nature of what is being built, not a quick fix, but a genuine developmental investment whose return accumulates over years, maintains the practice through the plateau periods and arrives at the 3rd and 4th year, having built something that cannot be replicated by any shorter or more dramatic approach. There is no way to compress this timeline significantly without losing the substance of what the timeline produces. The 3-year return is not 3 times the 1-year return. It is qualitatively different, because 3 years of consistent practice produces a depth of internalized standard and behavioral precision that 1 year of practice has not yet achieved. The depth is the product of the time as much as the practice itself. This is the honest framing of what consistent evening discipline produces. Not a rapid transformation, a genuine one, built privately, expressed publicly, and durable in a way that quick gains never are. Part 8. The final reckoning. What this costs and what it returns. Every investment has a cost and a return. The honest assessment of this particular investment requires stating both clearly. The cost of a consistent evening practice, maintained over the years necessary to produce its full return, is real. It is not primarily time. The time required is modest. It is primarily the cost of honest self-examination, maintained consistently through ordinary and extraordinary periods alike. Honest self-examination has specific costs. It requires confronting, regularly, the gap between chosen standards and actual conduct. It requires forming and implementing corrections without the option of excuse or justification. It requires maintaining a clear view of one's own behavioral patterns, including the patterns that are most comfortable to ignore, and accepting responsibility for changing what is within one's control to change. These costs are psychological rather than material, and they are real. The habit of honest self-examination runs directly counter to the human tendency towards self-justification. The cognitive bias, while documented and universally present, toward interpreting one's own conduct in the most favorable available light. Building the habit of genuine honesty about one's own behavioral patterns requires consistently working against this bias, which is uncomfortable in ways that are difficult to sustain without a clear understanding of what sustaining the discomfort produces. What it produces has been described throughout this message in terms of behavioral development. But the clearest statement may be the simplest. It produces a person who is consistently more capable in the situations that matter than they would otherwise have been. More capable in professional negotiation, because they have reviewed their own negotiating conduct with specific honesty and corrected specific deficiencies over years of deliberate practice. More capable in leadership, because they have examined their own conduct in leadership situations with the same honesty and developed the depth of internalized standard that reliable leadership requires. More capable in financial decision-making, because the clarity of mind that consistent resolution practice produces is directly applicable to the quality of judgment that consequential decisions require. These capabilities have financial value. In almost any professional context, the person who is consistently more capable in the situations that matter commands greater compensation, greater advancement, and greater independence than the person of equal starting ability who has not developed those capabilities through deliberate private discipline. The return is not guaranteed in any specific form or any specific timeline. It depends on the specific professional context, the specific capabilities developed, and the specific opportunities that the environment provides. But the direction of the return, toward greater capability, greater value produced, and the financial outcomes that follow from both, is consistent with everything that the examination of productive people across different fields and different eras has documented. The investment is a modest amount of time each evening, conducted with genuine honesty and maintained with consistency over years. The return is a fundamental improvement in the quality of the person doing the investing, in their clarity, their composure, their precision, and their capacity for sustained high performance. This is not a complicated calculation. The only complexity is in the execution, in maintaining the practice through the ordinary evenings when nothing remarkable is surfaced, through the periods of fatigue when the minimum viable practice is all that is sustainable, through the stages of development when the return is not yet visible enough to provide obvious confirmation. The practice is available to anyone willing to conduct it. What limits its adoption is not access or complexity. It is the rarity of the patience and honesty that its full execution requires. Begin tonight. Review one significant event from the day with specific honesty. Form one specific correction. Think briefly about one thing tomorrow requires. State clearly the standard the following day will be governed by. That is the minimum. It is enough to begin the compounding. And the compounding, given sufficient time, produces results that no amount of public effort, dramatic strategy, or motivated intensity achieves without the private foundation that these quiet evening hours build. The evening is arriving. What you do with its final minutes is now, as it has always been, entirely your decision.